in listen-only mode.
Greetings and welcome to our first webinar of the University of Minnesota Alumni Association's 2015-2016 webinar series. My name is Erin Elliott and I'm the Senior Director of Campus Engagement for the University of Minnesota Alumni Association. Thank you to all alumni and friends who have made time to join us live today. We're glad you've joined us today for the webinar, It's Not About Willpower, Why Diets Don't Work and What to Do Instead, with U of M Psychology Professor Traci Mann. Today's webinar is part of a free series being offered by the University of Minnesota Alumni Association, where we're having conversations with experts about career, life, and learning topics. We will be running monthly webinars from now until May. This webinar is being recorded and will be viewable afterwards at minnesotalumni.org/alumni webinar series. Just give us a few business days to post it on our website. If you're on Twitter right now, tweet us with hashtag UMM We'd love to hear from you. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. If you've joined the presentation listening to your computer speaker system by default. If you'd prefer to listen over the telephone, just select telephone and the audio pane of your GoToWebinar panel, and dial in information will be displayed. If you experience audio difficulties while listening via your computer speakers, this can be caused by having multiple software applications open, which can use up your computer's bandwidth and affect network performance. Feel free to close any unnecessary applications on your computer. Questions are welcome, and you may submit them at any time. Please type in your questions in the questions pane on your GoToWebinar control panel. We'll be monitoring them along the way, so please submit questions, ideas, tips. It's going to be a fun conversation. We want to hear from you. Now, I'm excited to introduce our presenter, Traci Mann. Traci is a professor of psychology at the University of Minnesota. She's received her PhD in 1995 from Stanford University, spent 10 years on the faculty at UCLA, and then moved to the University of Minnesota and started the Health and Eating Lab. She is interested in the science of self-control and weight loss and applying social psychology research to promoting healthy behavior, particularly eating, in individuals' daily lives. Her research has been funded by NIH, NASA, and the USDA. Traci, thanks so much for being with us today. All right. Hi, Traci.
Hi, thanks for having me. Am I unmuted?
You are.
Oh, good.
And
all right.
I'm just pulling up your slides right now. So thanks again for being with us. We're excited for a great presentation.
I'm happy to be here. Now, can my slides be seen?
They are, yes,
good.
They are.
Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you all for coming. I'm truly delighted to be here talking to you, and I'm going to jump right in because I know there will be lots of questions, and I want to make sure there's time to get to them. So, jumping right in. Given the title of the talk, you already know that I'm going to say that diets don't work, since the entire talk is about why they don't work. But first, let me at least give you sort of the story about that, about whether diets work. So first of all, any psychology question has the same answer, which is it depends. Do diets work? It depends. Well, it depends what you mean by work. What most people mean by work is you lose a lot of weight and you keep it off a long time. By that definition, diets don't work. In the short run, diets do work. You can lose weight. In the short run, it's not a lot of weight, though. So what the research shows is that dieters lose about 10% of their starting weight in the first year of a diet. You know, 10% of the starting weight is not that much weight. Most dieters aim to lose more than that. But that's what people lose in about a year. But more importantly than that is the long-term evidence. And in the long run, it's absolutely clear that diets don't work for the majority of people. So my lab years ago did research where we reviewed every single diet study that followed the dieters for at least 2 years after they started the diet. And what we found when we sort of put all those numbers together and crunched them together is that dieters regain all but about 2 pounds in the first 3 to 5 years of a diet. So on average, you're regaining all of it. That's basically what that's saying. Now, other research comes up with the number that 5% of dieters take off a lot of weight and keep it off for a long time, 5%, whereas the remaining 95 take off less or take off a lot but gain it all back. Okay, so diets don't work. And I should also add that diet companies know this, and there's all kinds of bizarre evidence out there that diet companies know this. One of them is that they argued with the FDA against having to put accurate information about their diets in their ads. And their argument took many forms, but this line was the one that always kind of blew me away, which is dieters will be discouraged from doing this diet if we actually give them realistic evidence of whether our diet works or not, basically admitting it doesn't work. Another little bit of interesting evidence on that count is that the CFO of Weight Watchers, he's the former CFO at this point, he actually admitted in an interview that their business comes from repeat customers. And he also, in that same interview, said dieting is like playing the lottery. Okay, that is not what most people think dieting should be. So that's alarming. Now, some of the first and most important work showing the typical trajectory of your weight when you go on a diet comes actually from right here at the U of M, and that's from the Minnesota Starvation Study by Ansel Keys. Now, I could put up all different kinds of evidence showing what happens when people go on diets, but I'm going to put up this because I actually personally do think it's the most important work on this, but also I feel like as U of M alums, you should appreciate and be proud that this work came from here. This is internationally regarded study. It's the seminal work on the topic, as they say. Anyway, the starvation study. Okay, and I know lots of you know about it already, but basically Ansel Keys had two goals. He wanted to, this was during World War II, he wanted to learn the best way to refeed starving people coming home from war, like prisoners of war, things like that. And he wanted to test different ways, different sort of combinations of diets to give people when they came back from war, like what would work best in refeeding them, getting them back up to normal weight. But in addition to that, he was just really interested in what happens to people while they're starving. And before he did this study, no one really could answer that question because all we knew about what happened to people while they were starving was from studies of explorers who got lost and kept journals, or from other people that were starving out in the world. And the problem with studying those people to learn about starvation is that so many other things are happening to those people in addition to just not having enough food. You know, they're in danger, they're fearing for their life, they're fearing for their families' lives, you know, all kinds of things are happening. So you can't really tell what's from the starving and what's not. So Ansel Keys wanted to study starvation in its pure, clean form, and so that's what he did. He got 36 conscientious objectors from the war who still wanted to contribute to the war effort, they just didn't want to fight. And actually he chose them from about 200 people who applied to be in his study, moved them here into a dorm underneath the stadium. Well, it's 2 stadiums ago now. I used to say under the old stadium. It is 2 stadiums ago. And they lived there in this dorm under the stadium for a full year. The first 3 months that they were there, they were allowed to eat whatever they wanted. And during that time, Dr. Keys measured every single thing he could think of to measure about them. So he measured their weight, but he also measured, you know, their kidney function and their lung capacity and, you know, how fast they could run on a treadmill. And he measured literally every single thing you could think of measuring about a person as a baseline. And then for the next 6 months, he starved them. And people always think that means he gave them no food at all. It doesn't. What it actually means is he gave them about 40% of the amount of calories that they were on average eating before. And so the amount of calories they actually ate on the semi-starvation study was 1,600 calories per day. But that was, given how much they were normally eating, that was few enough calories that caused them to lose a huge amount of weight. So they did the semi-starvation period for 6 months. They did that diet for 6 months. And I think of this as the first diet study because 1,600 calories a day is actually a typical amount that people eat on a diet nowadays. So that's why I think of this as a diet study. I sometimes refer to it as a diet study, which I shouldn't. It's not called that. In any case, 6 months on that. And then there were 3 months where he tested out the different rehab diets, giving them different amounts of food, different amounts of protein and stuff to see which worked best in getting them back up to weight. And then they had free eating for 3 more months. All right, so what happened on the study? First of all, they lost a ton of weight. This is how some of the men looked during the last weeks of the starvation period. They all got extremely, extremely skinny. But the reason I'm talking about this and providing this as evidence for the common trajectory of weight when you go on diets is because of this data here. So this data slide, let's walk through this slowly. It's a really, I think there's so much information right here on this one page. First of all, this slide is moving across time along the x-axis. So the C at the bottom there refers to the control period. And then S12 means after 12 weeks of starvation. S24 means after 24 weeks of starvation. That's when the starvation part ended. And then all the rest is rehab. And what you can see is, let's look first at the line with the colored in dark circles. That's their body weight. And what you can see is that from the control period through S24, through the end of the starvation, they lost weight steadily. They lost about, what is that, about 75% of their, sorry, they lost about 25% of their starting weight. They went from 100 to about 75% of their weight. But what you can see, and what's most important, is what happens after that. After the diet ends, what happens to their weight? Well, you can see it comes right back on, and it comes back on faster than it came off, and you can tell that it's faster because the slope is steeper. Okay, and it overshoots their starting weight. Their starting weight is that dotted line going across. So they lose weight at a steady pace, comes back on faster than it came off, overshoots the starting weight. So you weigh more than you started, and you'll see that it stayed above their starting weight all the way until maybe that last week, 58 weeks later of their rehab. Okay, so that is, I think, a really compelling demonstration of the short-term loss followed by long-term gain and overshooting where you started. And the other line there, just FYI, is body fat, and you can see there that the same thing happens, just more extreme. So they lose a lot of body fat quickly, but it comes back on even faster after they stop dieting, way overshoots their starting fat level. And at 58 weeks after the diet ended, they're still not back to the fat level that they were before doing the diet, or doing the starvation. Okay, so excellent. Okay, so the big question now is why? Why don't diets work? And it's, as in the title of this presentation, it's not about willpower. Now, I run an eating lab, and my research focuses on the self-control of eating. And whenever I tell people that I study that, the self-control of eating, they always say the same thing. Okay, nope, not that. That's not what they say. Nobody ever says this. Nobody has ever said to me, in 20 years of studying the self-control of eating, nobody has ever actually told me that they have good self-control or great self-control. Do these people exist? Maybe. I don't know. I'm sure they exist, but it's rare. And even with me saying this very thing repeatedly of late, nobody is coming out and telling me they're one of these people. What everybody actually says to me is, oh man, self-control of eating, I need that. That's what I need. That's what I struggle with. And everybody says it as if they have this unique struggle that most other people don't have. You know, all these people thinking they're alone in their inability to reliably resist foods, they're not alone. They're pretty much everybody. Okay, everybody struggles with self-control. Thin people, obese people, and everybody in between. And if everybody struggles with it, it's very difficult to see how it could possibly be the crucial factor that explains who's going to end up thin and who's going to end up fat. And sure enough, there's plenty of scientific evidence that willpower plays a much smaller role in people's weight than everybody assumes. And I'm going to tell you about some of that evidence, but first I just want to do sort of a thought experiment, not an experiment, but just a thinking exercise, just to help give you a sense of why willpower doesn't really matter very much when it comes to your weight. Okay, so imagine this situation. You're in a meeting and some lovely colleague of yours brings in a box of donuts and puts it down on the table, and you're trying to resist having a donut. Okay, resisting a donut requires multiple acts of self-control. It's not just one act. You have to resist it now, and you have to resist it 2 minutes from now, and you have to resist it basically every time you look up and notice that donut. You know, if you resist the donut the first 19 times you look up and notice it, and that's not unusual to look up every minute and notice it, and if you resist it the first 19 times you notice it, but then on the 20th time you have a 2-second moment of weakness and you take a donut, you don't get any credit for having shown such impressive self-control all those 19 times. You have nothing to show for those 19 very impressive acts of self-control. You may as well have bad self-control for all the good your good self-control did for you, right? You ate the donut, but so did your friend with much worse self-control who ate it on the 5th time they looked up and noticed it. Okay, so the bottom line with eating is that momentary lapses of self-control just erase previous successes at self-control. And what that ends up doing is essentially wiping out the differences between people, except on the extremes of the distribution. Now, that's not really true with other behaviors that involve self-control. So consider academic achievement or job success or things like that. For those kinds of things, you need self-control as well. You need self-control basically to persist at a difficult task. You need self-control to persist at studying for a test without getting distracted. So if you control yourself well most of the time that you're studying, but have a lapse here or there, you can actually still do really well. The couple moments of weakness where maybe you take 5 minutes away from studying and you go look at your email for a little while, those cost you a few minutes of study time, right? It costs you those minutes that you were looking at your email, but it doesn't erase all the impressive studying you did up until that moment. Okay, that's still in the bank, right? All that studying. It doesn't get erased by your moment of weakness the way your successful self-control of eating does get erased by a moment of weakness in controlling your eating. Okay, so the sum of that is that eating is particularly unforgiving of lapses in self-control. And lapses in self-control are also extremely hard to avoid with eating. Okay, we have just way too many opportunities to eat. There's just too many temptations all around us. And lapses, as I said in that example, and as I'm sure you all can relate to, they happen instantly. They just happen so fast. So willpower would have to be incredibly strong. It would have to be nearly perfect to handle that kind of thing. But it isn't. It's actually the opposite. And there's huge amounts of research showing how fragile and how easy it is to disrupt willpower. My lab actually did studies years and years ago where we put milkshakes in front of dieters and looked at what helped them resist the milkshake and what messed them up. And basically everything messed them up and nothing helped. That's sort of the summary of that entire decade of research. Now, another problem with willpower is that despite what you see on the covers of women's magazines, there is no evidence whatsoever that people can harness their willpower or grow their willpower. Okay, now I promised some evidence that willpower doesn't matter so much for weight, so I'm going to give you some. So there's a test they use in willpower research to see how good your willpower is. See how good your willpower, or also I will refer to as self-control, is to see how good these things are. And this test is called the Marshmallow Test. And all they do for this test is they leave a 4-year-old kid alone in a room with one marshmallow and tell them that if they don't eat that marshmallow, they can have 2 marshmallows later. And then they see how long the kids can resist it. Then they come back 10 years later and track these kids down again and see how they turned out. It's really amazing research. And what they find is that the number of seconds a kid can resist that marshmallow at age 4 actually predicts a whole bunch of things that happen to them later on in their life, including how well they do on the SAT and their weight. But it turns out that willpower is 8 times better at predicting your SAT score than your weight. Okay? Now, the technical way of saying that, just to be accurate here, is that willpower explains 32% of the variation between people in their SAT scores, but only 4% of the variation between people in their weight. That's what this graph is actually showing. Okay, so I feel like I'm getting a little complicated putting that up, but then again, you're U of M alum, so you're smart people. It's always nice to talk to a smart audience. But Just a simple way to remember how unimportant willpower is, or how unimportant self-control is when it comes to weight loss, is this example. Okay, so here's how you remember that self-control doesn't matter so much. Now remember I said there are only about 5% of dieters take off a lot of weight and keep it off for a long time? Well, consider somebody who's in that small minority of very special dieters, very successful dieters. Okay, this guy, Bill Clinton. Okay, love him. I do. I love the man. I'm not going to lie. But he's just not someone that most people would describe as having impressive self-control. Okay, and in fact, he's kind of known for having terrible self-control. Okay, but it doesn't matter, right? He still was able to lose a lot of weight and keep it off. Self-control is only slightly related to weight and weight loss. Okay, now in fact, if you've struggled to take off weight or struggled to keep it off, it's not because you have worse self-control or a weaker will than everybody else. It's not. So what is it because of? Well, actually before I answer that, just think in your head really quickly. If you know of anyone in your life who can eat whatever they want and yet they're still thin, okay, and they don't even exercise, right? You all know someone like this. We all know someone like this. I know people like this. Some of you maybe even are people like this. So that exists. I think we all know that exists. Now, you've never thought about it, but if you do for a minute, you might also realize that the opposite exists, that there's obese people who don't eat that much but are still obese. Now, for the longest time, obesity researchers denied that this kind of person existed. When they did studies where people had to record everything they ate for many days or many weeks, what they'd find is plenty of obese people who were not consuming that many calories. Sometimes even fewer calories than the thin people in the sample. Now, I should add, obesity researchers, when they were faced with this kind of evidence, they concluded that the obese people were lying, which I find egregious and outrageous, really harsh, just completely inappropriate. But turns out they're not lying. The lie is actually what we've all been taught as the gospel for our entire lives, which is that all you need to do to get skinny is to exercise off more calories than you eat. Now, if that were true, then we couldn't possibly have thin people who eat so much without getting fat, and we couldn't have obese people who eat so little without getting thin. It wouldn't be possible. But we do have these people, and that's because your weight is influenced by so much more than calories in, calories out. Okay, I was actually at an academic meeting earlier this summer, and somebody put up this diagram here showing all the different things that influence obesity. Seriously, they put up this diagram. I can see it as well as you can, which is not at all, because it's a gazillion billion things are on that diagram. Luckily, the next diagram they put up was the simplified one. Okay, still not remotely simple. You know, don't worry about the things on this slide. I'm actually going to talk about many of them, but don't worry about them. Except for the fact that all these things on this slide, for the most part, are genetic. Okay, now we know a lot about the genetics of obesity from many places, including from studies of people who were adopted. Now, adoption studies are quite interesting because you could compare the adult weight of kids who were adopted to the weight of their birth parents, with whom they share a lot of genes, to the weight of their adoptive parents, with whom they don't share any genes, but who they share an environment with, and who in fact set their eating environment for them. And what you find when you look at adoptees is that their genes, or I should say their adult weight, is much, much closer to their biological parents' weight than to their adoptive parents' weight. Okay, so what that's saying is that genes are playing a much more important role in their weight than their eating environment and the eating habits as learned from the parents who raised them. Now, we also know a lot about the genetics of obesity from studies of twins, which were these kinds of studies. Another reason to be proud to be a U of M alum. Twin studies were basically invented here, here in the psych department even, here at the U of M. They came up with the idea of comparing identical twins who were raised apart to each other. Now think about this. Identical twins share 100% of their genes if they're raised apart, and a surprisingly large number of pairs of identical twins were raised in completely different households within completely different families. And so what you can do with that is tease apart the genetic component from the environmental component, okay? Because they have different environments and identical genes. And what studies like that show is that genes account for about 70% of the variation between people in their weight. Okay, and just here's some pictures just for the fun of it. These are pairs of identical twins, again, sharing all their genes. And in most of the pairs, you see their weight is nearly identical to each other. Okay, now this next slide is pairs of fraternal twins sharing about 50% of their genes. Their weights are not nearly as similar to each other as the identical twins. But, and I don't have pictures of this, but you can picture this in your head, their weight is pretty different from some random other person who they don't share any genes with. Okay, so genes matter a lot. Now when you say something's genetic, people get this weird idea in their head that it's one gene, that the thing is just coded, it's one gene, and like so for weight, people think there's some gene that says you will weigh 150 pounds as an adult. Okay, that's way, way, way too simple. There's over 100 different genes linked to obesity, and they're finding more and more every year. This graph is just showing the number of genes that they found each year that influence the susceptibility to obesity. Just since 2007, just exploded with how many genes they found, and I'm sure they'll keep finding more and more. All right, so what kinds of things are coded on our genes that can affect our weight? Well, a bunch of things. I'm going to tell you about three. So first of all, hormones. Okay, the relative levels and responsiveness of dozens of different hormones are genetically coded, including the hormones of the gastrointestinal system, which we refer to as the gut hormones. All the slide is here to do is just to show you that there's a lot of them. I'm going to mention one, maybe two. One of these hormones, actually some of these hormones, determine how much you need to eat to feel full, and others determine when you feel hungry, or how often you feel hungry. And so some people, just genetically, might feel full from eating one sandwich. The other people of the same size might need to eat 3 sandwiches before their satiety hormone kicks in. If one sandwich fills you up, you're less likely to overeat. And it's because of these genetically determined hormone differences. What are you supposed to do if you need 3 sandwiches to fill you up? Are you supposed to only eat one and live hungry all the time? Now consider for a moment, just, I don't know, just something to think about. Do you think it's fair? Do you think it's appropriate as a society to expect some people to go through their life never feeling satiated, right? To always feel hungry just to achieve a certain weight? Yeah, I'm not so sure. Another thing hormones influence is which foods you like and want, basically how palatable you find different foods. Now, if you've ever been pregnant, you've experienced this, right? When you're pregnant, you have a huge change in your hormones, and your food preferences change. When I was pregnant, I wanted apples constantly. Normally, I don't care about apples. Boring. Who cares? Except the Honeycrisp. Love the Honeycrisp. Best apple ever. But when I was pregnant, all I wanted was apples. Normally, it's not what I want. Normally, I want ice cream. Normally, I want cookies. Now, clearly, this change in preferences when you're pregnant is hormonally related, clearly. So for some people, it's much easier to resist ice cream than it is for other people. But it won't be because of their brilliant self-control. They might think it is. They might even say it is. But it's not. It's because they weren't as tempted by it. It's not as enticing to them. It's not as palatable to them because of their hormones. Okay, so, it's like how they say it doesn't count as bravery if you weren't scared to do the thing in the first place, right? Well, same deal. It's not self-control if you didn't actually want the thing in the first place. That's just good luck. Right, now, you also know people like this, right, with preferences that don't seem to include yummy stuff. You'll be in a restaurant with them and it's time to order dessert, and they'll say, oh, no, 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 I really don't care for ice cream. I really don't care for chocolate mousse. Or I have someone in my own home who is like, I could never eat a marshmallow peep for breakfast. That's crazy. Okay, so annoying, people like that. Anyway, those are hormone differences. We like different things. Now, there's also neurological differences. People differ in their brain's responsiveness to the sight of food. So some people get a big reward response when they see certain foods, but other people don't. This reward response I'm talking about, it involves many things, but one of the things it involves is a rush of dopamine. Now, dopamine is the neurotransmitter. It's associated with reward. It's associated with addiction. Okay, addicts get a big rush of dopamine from the drugs they're addicted to. Okay, so some people get a big dopamine rush from seeing certain foods and others don't. Now, the bigger this reward response you get, the more pleasing you find it to think about and to eat that food. The more you're going to crave it, and the harder it's going to be for you to resist it. All right, so there's a lot of different neurological functions actually that influence people's susceptibility to obesity, and the reward response is just one of them. Okay, so neurological responses have a genetic basis. And then finally, the third one that I'm going to mention is metabolism. So your metabolism is genetically based. Your metabolism determines how efficiently you use the calories that come in and how many calories you burn just by doing the job of running the different systems of your body. So some people will burn up more of the calories from a donut than other people while just sitting still. Okay, and this is how you can have thin people who eat a lot and obese people who don't. You can put people on the same diet and completely different things will happen to their weight. You know, this graph actually shows what happened to 29 different people who were all on the very same, very low-calorie diet for 10 weeks. Each of those red bars is a different person. And what you can see is that some of those people lost a lot of weight. Right? Some lost a little weight, and some actually even gained weight. You know, when you see graphs like this, people sometimes say, well, I bet some of those people lied and ate more than they were supposed to. This is possible. So they actually do studies to control for that, where the dieters actually go and live in the researcher's clinic, or they live in a hospital. And the researchers just give them all the food they're entitled to. So they know that everybody has followed the diet exactly. And even still, you get this wide variation in what happens and how much weight they lose. Now, the same thing is also true for overeating. Okay, so this graph is from a study that apparently nobody would ever want to be in. This is a study where researchers first figured out for these participants the exact amount of calories they needed to stay at the same weight they were. And then they fed them an extra 1,000 calories more over and above that every single day for 100 days. Okay, so every day for 100 days they got 1,000 extra calories, and they weren't allowed to exercise. Each bar in this graph is a different person too, and you could again see huge variation in how much weight people gained. Some gained as little as 10 pounds, others as much as 30, okay, from eating the same exact thing. Now, the same thing is also true for exercise. I'm not going to talk about exercise much today, except for this remark, which is, this is another graph just like the others. Each bar is another person, except there's a weight bar and a fat bar for each person. But everyone in this study did the same intensity exercise for 12 weeks, and they did it in the researcher's clinic in front of them so they could be sure that they did it. And same thing as with the eating studies, some people lost a lot of weight, some lost a little, and some even gained. Okay, so crucial point one here is that your weight is based on a lot more than calories in, calories out, and genetically based factors affect so many aspects of it, okay, including things like how tempting a food looks to you, okay, how rewarding that food is to you, how much you crave that food, how hungry you feel after eating that food, and the rate at which you burn up the calories from that same food. If you're a thin person, you probably are on the lucky side with a lot of these factors, meaning the side that makes it easy to remain thin. If you're an obese person, odds are you're on the difficult side of all of these things. You're on the side that makes it hard. It just seems crazy to blame someone for their fatness or be impressed by their thinness, given that so much of it is based on these genetic differences. All right, so that's point one. Now, point two is where things get really frustrating for most people, because regardless of where you start out on these various biological factors I just went through, and I talked about how everyone's different on them, but regardless of where you start out, there is one thing that reliably messes them all up for everybody, and that thing is dieting. So if you restrict your eating for a while, if you lose weight, if your body detects that not enough calories are coming in, all of these biological factors change for the worse. They change in the way that undermines your efforts to keep the weight off. And this is why diets don't work in the long run for the large majority of people. Okay, so after losing weight, your metabolism changes. Okay, so that you run your body on fewer calories than before, which leaves more calories left over unused to store as fat. So if you eat the same amount of calories that you were eating when you lost weight on your diet, after a while, you're going to stop losing weight. Maybe you're even going to start gaining weight. What will people say? They'll say you had no self-control. They'll say you couldn't hack it, right? They'll say you aren't strong enough, even though you're eating so little, and probably less than anyone who would accuse you of these things. Okay, after losing weight, your hormone levels change. Okay, so you're more likely to feel hungry, and you need to eat more food to feel full. So if you're, again, eating the same amount of calories you were eating when you lost weight, you were probably feeling hungry then anyway. Now you're going to feel even hungrier, okay, because your hormones have changed. So to keep off weight, you have to always feel hungry. And then after losing weight, your brain changes in ways that make food more tempting. Okay, you become preoccupied with food. There's all kinds of interesting evidence for this. One bit of evidence for this comes, I alluded to this earlier, comes from journals kept by explorers. I brought a picture of this explorer, Robert Falcon Scott. He's a polar explorer, quite famous in England, even though he came in second trying to reach the South Pole. Not only that, not only did he come in second, but unfortunately he died on the way back. So it was disaster on all counts. In any case, he kept a journal till the very end, and he starved to death, a kind of combination of starving and freezing to death. His journal talks about food a lot. Lots of food talk in his journal. You can also see this preoccupation with food in the men from the starvation study, the Minnesota starvation study. They became obsessed with food. In fact, this was one of the most noticeable symptoms that the men had over the course of the starvation period. Several of the men vowed to take up new jobs in the food industry when the diet ended. Some vowed to open a grocery store or restaurant, for example, or become a chef or work on a farm. More than 2/3 of the men began clipping recipes from the newspaper during the course of the study, even though they never cooked before. And even though this is 1941, and these are men who, you know, generally at that time were not the ones doing the cooking. Over half of the men started reading cookbooks for pleasure, checking them out at the library here on campus, and reading them for fun. Now, you don't need to be starving to death like the explorers or be as hungry as the men in the Minnesota study for these changes to happen. These neurological changes happen when you lose weight, as little as 2 pounds. It's been shown these changes start to happen, or when you're depriving yourself of food. You think about it constantly. You're more likely to notice it if it's there, and eating food gives an even stronger reward response than before dieting. Okay, this is not ideal if you're trying to keep weight off. Okay, so point two is that dieting leads to these biological changes that make it incredibly difficult to keep weight off. Just that small minority of people manage to do it. Okay, and to do it, they have to go about their lives fighting all these things, basically eating very little, always feeling hungry, constantly thinking about food, constantly being tempted by food. Okay, it's a constant battle. Now, knowing about all these things makes me just absolutely furious when people blame dieters for regaining weight that they lost. I just want to scream when people say things like, well, they're still the one holding the fork, they're still the one shoveling it in. These are the exact kind of comments I often get after presenting data on diet, on the long-term trajectory of dieters' weight, I should say. Yes, people always say that. It just makes me want to scream. So yes, I'll grant them, they are indeed the one holding the fork. Yes, the person is holding the fork. But they're holding it in a completely different physiological and psychological context than someone who hasn't been dieting. So they're holding it in a context in which their biology has turned against them, right? In which there's completely different biological pressures, different physiological processes happening. And to succeed, they have to battle against them. So as a way of summary, if you've been dieting, you hold the fork in a context in which your hormones are preventing you from feeling full and causing you to feel extremely hungry, right? You're holding the fork in the context in which your brain is more likely to notice foods, pays extreme attention to thoughts of food, and cannot be easily shaken from those thoughts, right? You hold the fork in a context in which your brain is responding to food with a more powerful hit of reward, right? With extra pleasure and extra reinforcement. So yeah, fine, they held the fork, but it's this physiological situation that made them so likely to pick it up. Okay, so giant weight loss should not be the goal. What should be the goal then? Well, here's what I think should be the goal. I think the goal should be to reach what I'm going to call your leanest livable weight. This is the weight at the low end of your set weight range. That's the lowest weight you can be without setting off all these biological changes that are caused by dieting or by deprivation. Okay, those changes happen when you try to live below your set weight range. So instead of trying to live below it, aim to stay within it, but at the low end of it. Now, this might not be as low as your original goal, okay, but it's a weight you can maintain without it taking over your life the way diets do. It's a weight you can be healthy at. Okay, we need something between this damaging restrictive dieting and just letting everything go and eating anything anytime. And this is what I believe to be in the sensible middle. Now, in recent years, after giving up on willpower, I've been researching strategies for healthy eating that don't involve dieting and that don't depend on willpower. Okay, so I'm going to end by telling you about two simple strategies for healthy eating that don't require dieting or willpower. And then if you want more, I'm going to put up a screenshot of the cover of my book where there are 12 strategies in there. Okay, but first I'm going to water my mouth, so one moment. Okay. I see somebody just said, can't wait for what to do instead. Okay, here we go about what to do instead. Okay, so two categories of strategies I'm going to mention right now. Okay, the first category of strategies is to put obstacles between yourself and tempting food. Okay, so these strategies work great because most of us human folk are lazy. Okay, so obstacles usually slow us down, sometimes even stop us entirely. So for example, there's research from the Netherlands, from some of my colleagues out there, who showed that if there's a bowl of M&Ms across the room from where you're sitting, you won't eat as many as if the bowl is at your table. You'll eat about half as many as if the bowl's at your table. Okay, having to get up and walk across the room is actually a large obstacle. You have to stop what you're doing, you have to get yourself out of your chair, you have to walk the 5 feet. It's not nothing. But this is the important part. That same study also tested a tiny obstacle. Suppose the bowl of M&Ms is at your table, but instead of being right next to your hand at the table, you actually have to straighten your arm fully and extend it 2 feet across the table. You barely even have to lean forward to do that. Okay, even my little arms are 2 feet long. Okay, that's a tiny obstacle. It's hard to think of a tinier obstacle than having to extend your arm. Nevertheless, it makes a big difference. It makes as much difference as if you had to walk across the room. Okay, now does this kind of obstacle keep you from eating any M&Ms? No, but it helps you eat less. Okay, eating less, eating fewer M&Ms, but not necessarily no M&Ms, is what I believe should be the goal. Okay, because we need something that's livable. We need something that you can sustain your whole life, and you want to enjoy your life. And you should be able to have M&Ms. Restricting yourself from eating specific foods backfires. I did a study many years ago where we forbade our subjects from eating a particular food for a week, and we purposely had them pick a food that they didn't love. We had them pick a food that they felt neutral about. And nevertheless, being forbidden from eating that food made them think about it more and made them want it more. Now imagine if it's something that you love that you're forbidding yourself from eating. It backfires. Okay, so the first category of strategies is to put these obstacles up between you and the foods. Actually, before going on to the second strategy, let me answer the question that I see scrolling by repeatedly, which is how do you figure out your set weight range? People ask this all the time, and I apologize. There is no scientific answer to that. There's no scientific sort of calculation you can do to figure out your set weight range. Instead, you have to figure it out based on your own behavior. So your set weight, the range, basically encompasses what you weigh when you're doing sort of the middle of everything. So when you're eating but not binging, but not dieting. So when you're eating just sort of a middle amount. And it's when you are exercising some, but not a ton, right? So it's basically what you weigh when you're in the middle. And most people say that they can detect what this weight is, that they see themselves coming back to it, kind of no matter what they do, they kind of dance around it. They're always, you know, a few pounds above, a few pounds below, even 10 pounds above, 10 below, 15 above, 15 below, but they're always sort of dancing around this one point. And that's probably the middle of your set weight range. And then the goal should be to be at the lower end. Okay, and it is healthy to be at the lower end. Okay, so moving on, and I apologize, I know that's the least satisfying answer to that question. I wish I could satisfy you more, someday maybe. Okay, so that was the first category of strategies a moment ago. Now let me just give you the other category of strategies, and then we can flip to only questions. This category of strategies basically flips around the obstacle one I just described to help you eat more healthy foods by removing obstacles that come between you and them. So here's an obstacle to eating vegetables. Okay, for most people, especially kids, vegetables are not considered quite as yummy as other foods. They are for some people, but for most of us, they're not. Okay, so vegetables tend to lose to other foods when they're put in head-to-head competition, such as when they're all on a plate together. Okay, when they're all on a plate together, vegetables tend to lose. But here's a competition that a vegetable can win. Okay, vegetable versus nothing. I don't think a vegetable will beat nothing all the time, but it will beat nothing pretty often. Okay, so this strategy is what I call get alone with a vegetable, or veggies first. And it's just as easy as this. Eat a vegetable before you put any other food on your plate, or before you have any other food really on your table or in sight. Okay, if all you have is a vegetable and you're hungry, you're going to eat that vegetable. Put it next to the spaghetti on the plate and all bets are off. I actually came up with this strategy based on my kids in a restaurant one time when they were aged 3 and 6. The restaurant was a deli that would normally put a bowl of pickles on your table while you order, but this time maybe they were out, I don't know, but they put a giant bowl of sauerkraut on the table. I think sauerkraut's a hard sell for a kid. Nevertheless, my little kids gobbled it up, the entire bowl of sauerkraut, with their fingers, by the way. No man, heathens, these boys. In any case, if it's there and you're hungry, you will eat it. So we tested this strategy a couple ways. One way we tested it with my University of Minnesota colleagues from a number of departments. We tested it in elementary school cafeterias. Really important to get kids eating vegetables. Kids are not getting nearly the amount of vegetables they're supposed to get. So we went into elementary school cafeterias here in Richfield, and we just gave each student a little cup of vegetable of some sort to eat before they went into the cafeteria and got their food and filled their plate. Now here's some of the data from that. I feel like you are a data-loving crowd, which is why I've put up lots of graphs for you guys. The first graph shows what happened when we gave them a little cup of broccoli before going into the cafeteria, and the second one shows red pepper. And what you see is that the number of kids eating vegetables went way up when we gave it to them first. If they had to get their broccoli off the cafeteria line, very few kids would eat it. But if we gave it to them in a cup first, tons of kids would eat it, and not just eat it, but they would eat a lot of it. Okay, and I also had the girls in my freshman seminar last fall try to do this veggies first strategy for 3 weeks, and it increased the amount of vegetables they ate by a lot. But not only that, they also ate fewer calories overall, even though they weren't even trying to reduce their calories, because eating more vegetables often means eating less of something else. So I strongly recommend strategies where you focus very hard on eating more healthy stuff without worrying about stuff you're not allowed. Okay, just focus on eating more of the healthy and things should smooth out. Okay, so overall, the key to these two strategies and the others in the book, oh wait, here's what the book looks like. Very lovely cover. These strategies will work even though your willpower is crappy. Okay, will work no matter how little willpower you have. And what I recommend is that you make these kinds of simple changes, okay, and then just get on with it, okay? Because you need to live your life, and if you do this, you can improve your health, you can reach this leanest livable weight, feel better about yourself, and stop worrying so much about your weight. I really hope that people feel liberated by this message and not discouraged by it. The book starts with the 3 dreaded words, diets don't work, but the last 3 words are much, much more pleasing. It ends with the 3 most cheerful words of all, cup or cone. Okay, so I'm hoping very much that you're not discouraged. Let me just put up the names of my many collaborators, and now I'm going to try to answer your questions. Let's see, what do I start with? Oh, if the gene is the primary factor, how do we explain the population gaining weight overall? Oh, there's lots and lots of reasons why people are gaining weight overall. And in particular, that genes don't explain everything. They explain about 70% of the variation in weight, and environmental things do matter. I would add also that the increase in weight is not a small number of people adding a large amount of weight. It's a large number of people adding a small amount of weight, and that's perfectly consistent with a primarily genetically based basis for weight. What do I think of the no S eating? I don't know what that means. Nose? I don't know what that means. I'm sorry. I don't know the nose method. What research are you involved in now? We are continuing to test veggies first. We are getting ready to go to the state fair and collect some information about the strategies people are using at the fair or before or after the fair to allow themselves to do the kind of eating that most people do at the fair. What else are we doing? We're about to start a coffee study where we're trying to teach people. I have a coffee expert, and we're trying to teach people to appreciate the flavor of coffee so that they'll reduce the amount of sugar in their coffee. We're about to start that. Because some people add an extra 200 calories or more a day just from the sugar in their coffee. I know, it's insane. What else? I don't quite know what that question is. All I will say about sugar is people are very alarmed about sugar these days. I'm not an expert on sugar. There's more and more evidence that sugar is particularly problematic, and equally alarmingly, I would say, at the same meeting I was at earlier in the summer at NIH, they were also extremely concerned about all the fake sugars that people use, what they call the non-nutritive sweeteners. Those tend to be just as bad as sugar in being linked to obesity, believe it or not. So yeah, so there's lots of concern about sugar now, and I don't know the technical aspects of it, the chemical aspects of it. How can you be in future studies? You can't, you know too much now. Only people who have no idea that we're doing sneaky studies can be in our studies. You can come work in the lab. We're always looking for volunteers. Actually, we're not right now. We just filled up, but I'm sorry. Can't be in a study. But feel free to email me and tell me your your eating intuitions that make you want to be in a study, because I'd love to hear them.
And Traci, do you want to give the audience your email address too?
Sure. Um, it's Traci Mann at Gmail, and Traci Mann is spelled with an I, Tracimann at Gmail.
Thank you.
Yep. I was an early adopter, so I got my actual name. So yeah, feel free to email. I'm slow to get back, but I will. I really will, I promise. Paleo, low carb. Okay, here's the deal. I put those in the category of fad diets. There's always a new fad diet. They generally look a lot like a fad diet from, a couple decades ago. There's never anything new in dieting. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's paleo, if it's low carb, or what it is. You take off weight from all of these diets, no matter what the creator of the diet says. You take off weight from these diets because they lead you to eat fewer calories. Even low carb, they lead you to eat fewer calories. So I discourage those diets. I really do. I don't think you should be dieting. I think you should just make these sensible changes and, get on with it. I don't think people need to be going around with diets taking over their life. I am not able to answer the insulin question. Apologies. Thoughts on the amount of water people drink and weight gain. I have not seen research on this. People say that water fills them up and helps them eat less. That is certainly not my personal experience, but I've heard people say that. If it does for you, more power to you. Let's see, willpower and exercise. Okay, so exercise, interesting. So the issue with exercise, the self-control aspect of exercise is getting yourself to do it, and it's difficult. Now willpower, a moment of weakness with exercise doesn't undo prior exercise. So willpower would matter more than it does with eating, maybe not as much as it does with studying or that kind of thing. I do have a chapter in the book giving lots of strategies for sticking to your exercise program. So that's a place to look for those. But I struggle with that every day. And I ran this morning. It wasn't pretty, but I did it.
Traci, I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, which one do you think? There's so many going by. Let me pick one that I can actually give a decent answer to. I don't know of any drugs in development not just that are groundbreaking. I just don't know. There's nothing that I know of that will change your set weight, that will change your metabolism in the better direction. Set weight can get higher but not lower, unfortunately. Where do you get the book? Amazon. Amazon.com. Yeah, why not? Order on Amazon. It's a very fun book. I highly recommend it. I'm a completely objective critic of that particular book. Okay, I'm going to do that last one. Do you feel your sensible changes of more veggies and healthy choices lends itself to look similar to paleo? Oh, I don't know. I don't think so. No, I don't know. If it does, I maybe am not as clear on the paleo diet as I thought I was. Anyway, sensible changes, more vegetables, can't go wrong. Oh, microbiome, fun, some other day.
Traci, thank you so much. This was fantastic. Thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome. So fun to talk to the alums, even though I can't actually see them.
Thank you, Traci. Thank you all. We have some additional webinars coming up featuring some wide range and engaging topics, such as our next one in September 17th, Destination College, a webinar for parents and families of future college students. And then in October 15th, it's Say No to Networking and Yes to Growing Your Network, a user's guide to intentional connecting. And all of these are available for registration on minnesotalumni.org/alumni webinar series. If you're on social media, don't forget to connect with the University of Minnesota Alumni Association on Twitter, LinkedIn, or visit our home webpage to see all of our different channels. In closing, members of the University of Minnesota Alumni Association make new initiatives like this webinar possible. Thank you. Because of our members, you enrich the lives of alumni, support student success, and make a better University of Minnesota. Become a member today at minnesotaalumni.org/join. This is the conclusion of today's webinar. Thank you again for joining us and being an active member of the worldwide community of the University of Minnesota Alumni and Friends. Have a wonderful day and Skye Ma.